Imagine waking up one morning and learning that nuclear missiles capable of obliterating your city could be launched in just a few minutes from an island only 90 miles away. In October 1962, that wasn't a movie plot, it was reality. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the edge of nuclear war in what became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Fighter jets were fueled, submarines were loaded with nuclear torpedoes, and millions of people quietly wondered if they would live to see another sunrise. In secret bunkers and crowded situation rooms, a handful of leaders had to decide, are we willing to risk the end of the world over missiles in Cuba? Historians now believe that several times during those days, we came within a hair's breadth of catastrophe. In this video, we'll walk through those 13 days we almost lost everything. To understand just how close we came to nuclear war, we need to slow down those chaotic October days and look at them from inside the rooms where decisions were made. This video will take you step by step through the Cuban Missile Crisis, what led up to it, how it unfolded hour by hour, and how it was finally diffused. We'll look at John F. Kennedy in Washington, Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow, and Fidel Castro in Havana, each seeing the same crisis through very different eyes. We'll examine the spy planes, the secret tapes, the back-channel messages, and the near misses the public never saw. If you're interested in deep, well-researched history breakdowns like this, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. And stay with me until the end, where we'll pull out the key lessons this crisis still holds for our nuclear-armed world today. The Cuban Missile Crisis didn't appear out of nowhere. It grew from three powerful forces colliding: revolution, fear, and the Cold War arms race. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed Batista regime in Cuba, just off America's shore. Washington soon saw Castro's new government as a communist foothold in the Western Hemisphere. The United States imposed sanctions, supported exiled Cubans, and in 1961 backed the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, an embarrassing disaster for President Kennedy that pushed Castro straight into the arms of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the US had stationed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, close to Soviet borders, and maintained overwhelming strategic superiority. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev felt encircled and humiliated. At the same time, both superpowers were testing more powerful nuclear weapons, building bombers and missiles in a deadly race for advantage. Into this mix of mistrust and brinkmanship, Cuba became the most dangerous square on the global chessboard. From Khrushchev's perspective, secretly placing nuclear missiles in Cuba seemed like a bold, elegant solution to several problems at once. It would protect his vulnerable new ally, Fidel Castro, from another US invasion. It would quickly narrow the nuclear gap by putting medium and intermediate range missiles just minutes from Washington, New York, and dozens of US bases. And it would answer the American missiles in Turkey that could strike Soviet cities with similar speed. Soviet planners called the operation Anadir, disguising it as a deployment to the Arctic in their paperwork. Thousands of troops, technicians, and missiles were shipped to Cuba under extreme secrecy, often at night, with warheads packed in crates labeled as agricultural equipment. By early October 1962, launch sites for SS-4 and SS-5 nuclear missiles were under construction in Cuban fields. The Soviets believed if they moved fast enough, the world would wake up to a fait accompli, missiles already installed and operational. The secret couldn't stay hidden forever. The US had been flying U-2 spy planes, high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft over Cuba for months, taking thousands of detailed photos. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 piloted by Major Richard Heiser flew over western Cuba. The next day, analysts at the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington began examining the film. They spotted unmistakable evidence: long, cigar-shaped missile transporters, launch pads under construction, and associated support vehicles. These were Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles with enough range to hit most of the eastern United States. The discovery was rushed to the White House. On October 16th, President Kennedy was abruptly awakened with the news. The photographs removed all doubt. The Soviet Union had placed offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba despite previous assurances this wouldn't happen. The age of vague suspicion ended in a single moment of photographic clarity, and the countdown to confrontation began. Kennedy immediately convened a small secret group of advisors known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm. For the next 13 days, this group would meet almost constantly, wrestling with the most consequential choices any leaders had ever faced. Tapes secretly recorded by Kennedy captured their debates. Some military commanders demanded immediate airstrikes to destroy the missile sites, followed by an invasion of Cuba. Others warned that Soviet troops on the ground might already have nuclear warheads and authority to use them if attacked. Some urged a naval blockade, or quarantine, to stop more missiles from arriving while keeping diplomacy alive. Kennedy, haunted by the Bay of Pigs fiasco, resisted pressure for quick, dramatic action. He wanted options that punished the Soviets and removed the missiles without triggering a spiral into full-scale war. Around that table, rational men argued passionately, fully aware that any misstep could unleash nuclear fire. Outside those doors, the public knew nothing. Kennedy had to decide not only what to do, but how and when to reveal the crisis to the world. Meanwhile, U.S. forces quietly went on heightened alert. Nuclear bombers were dispersed to multiple airfields, some placed on airborne alert. Strategic Air Command moved towards DEFCON 3 and then 2, one step from war. On October 22nd, after nearly a week of secret deliberations, Kennedy addressed the nation on live television. In a calm but firm speech, he revealed the existence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and announced a naval quarantine to prevent further offensive weapons from reaching the island. He warned that any missile launched from Cuba would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union, demanding a full retaliatory response. As televisions flickered in living rooms around the globe, millions suddenly realized they were living through the most dangerous moment in human history so far. The naval quarantine was a calculated middle ground. Legally, a blockade is an act of war, so the administration used different language, arguing it was a defensive measure to prevent offensive weapons from entering the Western Hemisphere. U.S. Navy ships formed a ring around Cuba, instructed to stop and inspect Soviet vessels suspected of carrying missiles or related equipment. It was an incredibly dangerous game of chicken at sea. Soviet captains were ordered not to submit to boarding, and nobody knew exactly how far each side was prepared to go. Would an attempt to halt a single ship spark a firefight, then an escalation spiral? In the days that followed, American destroyers tracked Soviet cargo ships moving toward the quarantine line. Some turned back, others slowed or stopped. Each blip on the radar represented not just metal and fuel, but the possibility that a misinterpreted signal or panicked reaction could ignite a war no one could control. While warships maneuvered, an invisible war of messages and misdirection raged between Washington and Moscow. Former U.S. Ambassador Llewellyn Thompson urged Kennedy to think like Khrushchev. The Soviet leader feared humiliation and encirclement, but also wanted to avoid nuclear war. Back-channel communications began to flow. On October 26th, Khrushchev sent a long, emotional message suggesting a deal. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba if the U.S. promised not to invade the island. The next day, a second, tougher message arrived, publicly demanding the removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey as well. Inside the White House, confusion reigned. Which message reflected Khrushchev's real position? Should the U.S. respond to the first, softer letter and ignore the second? Diplomats, translators, and advisors pored over every word, every phrase, trying to read the mind of a man they had never met in person, while the clock kept ticking. As the political chess game continued, the situation on the ground in Cuba was far more volatile than Washington or Moscow fully understood. Soviet forces had already assembled many of the missiles. Some were nearly operational. Crucially, there were also tactical nuclear weapons on the island, shorter-range systems that could annihilate invading U.S. troops or nearby bases. Command authority for some of these weapons was dangerously ambiguous. Cuban and Soviet commanders, expecting a U.S. attack at any moment, dug trenches, fortified positions, and braced for invasion. Fidel Castro, convinced that war was inevitable and that Cuba might be destroyed anyway, reportedly urged the Soviets to stand firm, even if it meant nuclear conflict. That mindset, expecting annihilation and preferring martyrdom over surrender, terrified Soviet leadership. In Washington, U.S. generals drew up invasion plans largely unaware of just how many nuclear weapons were already in place, ready to be used if Americans landed on Cuban soil. Perhaps the most dangerous single moment of the entire crisis didn't happen in a strategy room, but deep underwater. On October 27th, U.S. Navy ships detected a Soviet submarine, B-59, near the quarantine line. Unaware that it carried a nuclear torpedo, the Americans began dropping practice depth charges, small explosives meant as warning signals, not lethal attacks. Inside B-59, conditions were nightmarish. Extreme heat, failing communications, and no contact with Moscow. The crew believed war might already have begun. The captain and political officer argued for launching their nuclear torpedo at the U.S. fleet, an act that almost certainly would have triggered a global nuclear exchange. It took the stubborn refusal of one man, Second Captain Vasily Arkhipov, to block the launch. He insisted they surface instead. His calm under unimaginable pressure probably saved tens of millions of lives, though the world wouldn't learn his name for decades. On Black Saturday, October 27th, the crisis spiked in multiple directions at once. Another U-2 was shot down over Cuba, killing pilot Major Rudolph Anderson, the only direct combat fatality of the crisis. Some in the U.S. military argued this attack demanded retaliation. At the same time, a separate U-2 accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace near Alaska, nearly provoking a confrontation there. Miscommunications layered on miscalculations. Yet amid this chaos, diplomacy pushed forward. U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. In a tense, late-night conversation, he offered a private deal. The U.S. would publicly promise not to invade Cuba if the Soviets removed their missiles, and quietly agree to withdraw American Jupiter missiles from Turkey within a few months, as long as that part stayed secret. It was a face-saving exit. Both sides could claim something, and more importantly, both could step back from the abyss. On October 28th, the world finally exhaled. Radio Moscow broadcast a message from Khrushchev announcing that the Soviet Union would dismantle and remove its missiles from Cuba under UN supervision. In exchange, the United States publicly pledged not to invade Cuba. The secret understanding about US missiles in Turkey remained hidden from the public, but it helped Khrushchev justify his retreat within the Kremlin. In the weeks that followed, Soviet ships carried missiles and bombers out of Cuba, while U.S. reconnaissance confirmed the dismantling of launch sites. The immediate crisis had passed, but its political aftershocks were enormous. Kennedy emerged with his reputation strengthened at home, though some hawks thought he'd been too soft. Khrushchev's standing within the Soviet leadership eroded, contributing to his ouster 2 years later. Castro, excluded from the final deal about his own territory, felt betrayed and increasingly distrustful of both superpowers. The Cuban Missile Crisis didn't just end a terrifying standoff, it reshaped how the superpowers managed nuclear danger. Both sides had been shocked by how swiftly events spiraled beyond their control, how misread signals, local decisions, or technical glitches could have ended civilization. In the aftermath, Washington and Moscow installed a direct hotline to allow instant communication between leaders during future crises. They also began moving toward arms control agreements, including the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963. For Kennedy, the crisis reinforced the importance of empathy, trying to understand an adversary's fears and domestic pressures. For the Soviets, it underscored the risks of secret gambles and over-reliance on military leverage. Above all, the 13 days of October 1962 taught the world that nuclear brinkmanship is not a game of chicken you can confidently win. It's a game where miscalculation alone can destroy everyone. Understanding the Cuban Missile Crisis isn't just about revisiting a narrow escape from history. It's about recognizing patterns we still see today: rival powers, nuclear weapons, local conflicts that can spiral, and leaders pressured by pride, fear, and domestic politics. If you found this deep dive useful, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss future long-form breakdowns of turning points like this. Share this video with someone who thinks nuclear war is only a relic of the past, and let me know in the comments which decision or moment during these 13 days shocked you the most. I've linked recommended books, declassified documents, and films inspired by the crisis in the description if you want to go further. And if you'd like a follow-up episode on other near misses like Able Archer 83, tell me below. Thanks for watching, and remember, history's closest calls are warnings, not just stories.